Chair Gibbs, Supervisor Hart, and participating remotely, we have Supervisors Marshall and Poole. Supervisor Reynolds and Lemmer have been excused. So nobody has approached me, either of us, relative to public comments, so we will move on to item 5.
I believe there was a public comment submitted via email to everyone on HR Finance Committee.
All right. That is outside the context of verbal comments, but I would direct everyone to their emails. So, but nobody has approached the chair or the clerk. Item is 5A, consideration of the 2025 budget and authorization for publication. So we received the budget last week with a quicker turnaround time, and this is a start of the process. And one of the things that we need to do today is to advance the budget for publication consistent with statutory requirements. And from there, then we will have a public hearing, seek committee involvement. This committee has the ability to modify the budget today prior to publication, as well as make recommendations going forward. So, Administrator Leonard, is there anything you wanted to add for today?
No, nothing at this point. Happy to answer any questions, but I think you've laid out the process well.
So we need a motion to have the item on the table. What are are there any questions, or what are your wishes? I would need a Supervisor Hart.
I'll make a motion to accept the administrator's 2025 budget.
The correct motion would be authorize the budget for publication.
Authorize the budget for publication.
Thank you. Is there a second? Seconded by Chair Gibbs. Is there any discussion on the motion? We have an amendment that has been offered by Supervisor Marash and myself relative to trying to address the issue of the delinquent property. And that was included in the packet. We realize that it came late in the process, but it was I think totally in response to the information that we've recently received relative to the amount of back taxes and the fact that we wrote off in 2010, 11, 12 over approximately $100,000 of taxes, special assessments, and that doesn't include interest charges. And I think there's a desire, we've been talking about the issue of trying to get our arms around the issue of back taxes. And again, we're writing off anything that's 10 years old or older. And I think in light of the information that we received, there's a desire to try to establish a process by which the county can be more aggressive relative to dealing with the issue of those tax delinquent parcels. We've started that process by modifying the tax taking process to do tax deed and the NREM process, which allows us to expedite that process and is more formal and seems to have yielded a result of people paying their back taxes versus our needing to foreclose on them. But we still have a very significant amount of valuation. In what happens at the end of the tax period, the county buys the tax rolls from other municipalities. For instance, the Wausau School District, the Technical College, the municipality, and any special assessments associated with those, and we pay those communities, and we're left holding the outstanding amount. And if that isn't paid, we not only lose what would have come to the county, but we lose what we've paid to the other communities. So there's a reason for us to advance a policy or a program by which we can recoup those back taxes quicker. I don't anticipate that this will be a permanent, long-term position, but rather let us play catch-up and then try to use the processes that we put in place recently to deal with the management of on an ongoing basis. Supervisor Marash, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the whole purpose of this is to provide a specific funding mechanism to support the economic development activities. Our administrator has a work plan he needs to accomplish, and it does not have time to play realtor. So based on the other information that we've learned, like July, for the example, the Triple ED committee had the regional economic threats presentation by Dave Ekman and learned that we are not in a good position like all other counties aren't, and using this opportunity to amend the budget for a specific position would be very beneficial in my opinion. Also, the WCA, we had the Wisconsin's Changing Economy presentation, the Workforce and Population Shift presentation by Dale Knapp that also gave a lot of not encouraging information. So I just think this is a time that we could put this in the budget and do something proactive for our county instead of sitting on our hands. Thank you.
Are there, Chair Gibbs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the other thing that's got to be brought to, to bear is we have some significant opportunities and some properties in Marathon County that are currently held by Marathon County. Primarily, River Drive is at very near future going to be vacated by the departments that are there. And so redevelopment of that and having the capacity in the administration's office to assist in whatever the board's wishes are on that redevelopment. Not only that, we also look at the social services facilities and the redevelopment of that. So I'm in support of bringing on a position to be able to provide those that capacity to administration to be able to, I think in the long term, serve the taxpayers of Marathon County well in one, potentially developing housing, or not developing housing, but doing economic development and assisting in what has been a long-term issue that we've dealt with as far as back taxes. So I'm in support of the amendment. So I'd make a motion to add or to amend and add Amendment 1 to the proposed budget as presented.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Is there any discussion? Supervisor Hart.
I have 3 questions on the
Supervisor Hart first,
proposal.
then Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to comment on this, especially the part where implementing strategies to get tax foreclosed properties developed, as that's been probably the #1 issue of the last year that I've heard from constituents inside my district and people outside of my district even. There's a real need to do something with these properties, and I'm glad to see that we're moving something forward to help get that done. Thank you.
Supervisor Marshall.
I was hoping that through our process that new positions are usually, we're given a job description, we're given goals and objectives. None of that was provided to us. From what I understand, this person will report directly to Lance in administration. And if the position is successful, there should be offset in additional gains to the county that would offset any tax levy. In other words, there shouldn't be additional levy needed if the position is successful. So I would make an amendment that, to the amendment, that while the position may go forward, it has a 0 impact to tax levy.
Is there a second?
I'll second Supervisor Marshall on that.
Is there any discussion on the motion? Chair Gibbs.
I totally appreciate the supervisor's thought process, although the challenge becomes this, and that is we don't budget on anticipated revenue that we hope that this process and project will generate. If this position is successful and it does generate additional revenue, it would go into the general fund and potentially roll over into CIP the following year. Although the merits of the potential revenue are significant, I couldn't support the amendment simply because we don't budget on possibilities of revenue generated by this position. So I can't support that position.
I'd just like to interject.
I would say that all of our revenue is projected. Sales tax revenue is not guaranteed. It's based on a belief that should we be successful as a county, we have sales tax revenue. Similarly, if this position cannot generate at least $157,000 of additional revenue for the county through its activities, then we should not be supporting it at all.
The position that's being proposed is actually there's funding to be put in the casual employee expenditure fund, which gives us, they're not permanent positions, but rather temporary positions to respond to an ongoing need. One of the reasons why I don't support the amendment to the amendment is that there are two ways that we will generate revenue through this position. One is through the taking of an eventual then sale of those properties, and that takes some time. And if you go back and look at our history, we started the MREM process about a year ago. And we finally took 18 properties just recently. Now, some of them paid the back taxes, which is a success, but there is a significant delay between the start of the activities, doing the record search, beginning the process of filing with the court and following up. And there's a delay. And the second way that we generate revenues is through new activity and putting those properties back on the tax roll. There's a year lag in those processes. So our ability to recoup and fund these positions on an ongoing basis, there aren't the dollars generated as we start the process to implement the process that would result in the net new revenues. And it very well may be that many of the revenues in the funds received will be in the 2026 tax year, and the benefits to the county by the time we identify, start the process, take them, put them up on surplus property and sell them. So there is a significant lag. Chair Gibbs.
The other thing is that the tax revenue that is booked on these properties are already in accounts receivable. The anticipation of reduced write-offs is the potential revenue savings. And again, as you Chair point out, getting these properties back on the tax rolls. So again, I think there's a significant difference.
Supervisor Hart.
One follow-up question, if I could.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One other thing, too, that was brought up is that this is compared to the sales tax, but we have a history for the sales tax. We base that off and kind of the projection of the current economic status. We don't have a history of how this will impact. We could probably have a best guess, but with the current housing market so volatile, I'm uncomfortable saying that we will generate exactly this, and especially generate exactly this in the next year. This is putting money where there currently isn't any money, which we can't just create that. So thank you.
Supervisor Marshall.
In the NREM process, when you take the property, there is, from what I understand, Corp Counsel as well as treasurer costs assigned to that property to be recouped. Similarly, if you're going to say this position has additional responsibilities in bringing that property onto the tax roll, that again would be something that could be assigned to that property as far as a cost of doing business. And that is something that could be recouped along with the same way we do it with Corp Counsel and Treasurer's Office.
There's a difference, though, between taking the property and moving it back into productive use. And that involves the clerk's office, and we've used the surplus property. So we've got a process by which we take it. We basically stop the bleeding in terms of our paying out to other units of government, but then we still haven't recovered our costs. We allocate those in light of the Hennepin County Supreme Court decision. We can only, when we sell the property,
Exactly.
recoup
So you could
our costs.
attach
Excuse me, Supervisor
related to
Marshall.
this
Excuse
position.
me, Supervisor Marshall, you are out of order. Let me finish my comments, and then you may comment. But we have processes by which we can, there is that delay, and, so the treasurer is in charge of working with the Corporation Counsel through the courts with the NREM process. We then take the title, the clerk then prepares it, does the appraisal, and then we put it up for sale, and there is a delay in that process, and there is not an immediate return to the county. Supervisor Marshall.
Then perhaps the definition of what this position would be doing is, I'm not understanding, because I understand that at least it's described as they will be enhancing or speeding up the process of these properties getting onto the tax roll being sold. And if that's the case, then that's an additional person involved in that activity. Like I said, there is no job description. There is these are what the goals are going to be for this position. And it's difficult to support something on a short notice without having it completely go through the new FTE process as outlined in our budget guidelines.
We've had some preliminary discussions with Administrator Leonard. I would call on him to explain why this is in the casual employee account.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. To your point, Supervisor Marshall, two things. First, as was raised by a number of supervisors, this is kind of in response to additional information relative to a couple of things, as Supervisor Marash laid out, just general economic development related activities that I drafted the amendment on behalf of supervisors that expressed a willingness for the county to start to play a role in an area where it hadn't based on opportunities. The second, with respect to tax foreclosure processes, I drafted the language in the amendment, and certainly this is a policy question for the board, but I drafted it intentionally broadly based on the broad kind of objectives that the supervisors had indicated. For example, with respect to addressing the shortage of workforce housing in the county, there were two things that resonated in my conversations with the supervisor, so I put it in the language that they ultimately reviewed, and that is, one, to create that inventory of county-owned properties that could be redeveloped, which was a strategy that was addressed at the recent Wisconsin Counties Association conference. And second, the developing and implementing strategies relative to tax foreclosed properties for owner-occupied housing. Right now, under our current practice that you rightly laid out, Supervisor Marshall, that we can add fees for the activities of staff to sell those properties. One of the strategies that was utilized in, at least in Bayfield County, was the idea of putting a covenant on those tax foreclosed properties to indicate that they needed to be utilized for owner-occupied housing. That ultimately is a county board decision whether or not to move forward in that fashion. Again, we don't have that process via resolution here. So, and then broadly, more economic development related activities relative to the properties that the county owns. The board hasn't, apart from the budget resolution and the amendments last year relative to the redeployment of the River Drive properties, some direction and some, quite honestly, some staff assistance to carry that out, at least from my perspective, given the broad and significant number of priorities that have been identified for administration. We just need to have resources to do that. To your point, however, about identifying funding sources, I certainly think we can and would commit to keeping a record of what I might call the return on investment of the position and keep the HR Finance and Property Committee informed. But I drafted this amendment really challenging the Board of Supervisors to develop exactly what you just referenced, which are the goals and objectives for the position. Those are things that the county board needs to come up and identify. Are we looking at simply the number of properties that are returning to the tax roll, or is it something more targeted to workforce housing? That's the direction that I'm going to need from the board. And of course, I would not hire a position until the county board provided me that information. We do that with any vacant position. We only post once we have the job description reviewed and we are in a position where we feel comfortable relative to the goals and the need for that position. So my thought process, being put on the spot by the chair, is that I would wait until the board provided me those specific things before we would post the position. I'm not inclined at all to incur additional cost until we have those pieces in place. But this is drafted in such a way it does not create a new position. Under our Chapter 4.20, it is drafted in a way to go into that limited term employee or casual employee fund that I referenced in the budget for that exact reason. If the board ultimately wants to create a full-time position after the analysis of return on investment, there is a very specific process for that laid out in ordinance. I don't know if that was what you're looking for from my perspective, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions or comments? All right, so we have, first item up is the amendment to the amendment. The amendment to the amendment calls for there to be zero tax increase. So I think the amendment effectively, and when Corp Counsel isn't here, the amendment to the amendment effectively guts the amendment because we're dealing with a budget transfer.
My sense is we need some specificity relative to what the revenue source is going to be to offset the expense. In the current amendment number 1, it's drafted in such a way to call for the funding source to be sales tax. If there is a desire to have essentially an offset, my inclination would be you'd increase I'm looking at Sam, but miscellaneous revenue within the treasurer's office as they receipt the proceeds from tax foreclosure sales.
Correct.
So how would, so Supervisor Marshall, let me ask if the intent of your motion would be to increase the revenue budget to the Sheriff's Department, looking at paragraph 2.
It would be to increase miscellaneous revenue in the treasurer's office.
Or would that be to item 2 or paragraph 2?
I think at this point you'd have to strike the first one, and then it'd have to be an increase to miscellaneous revenue, decrease to tax levy, and then because the position sits in county administrator, you need to increase the tax levy there, so that still nets out to zero. It's just where that revenue source is coming from.
So the effect, so the Supervisor Marshall, and your amendment would not be to have zero impact on tax, but rather to delete
There would be no tax levy necessary if you increase the amount of payroll and you increase the amount of miscellaneous revenue. There's no tax levy necessary.
So, but I'm looking at how we're amending the resolution. So the intent of your resolution has to be quantified for purposes of a vote. So would deleting paragraph, or the paragraph number, label number 1, modifying the language in paragraph 2 from
Sales tax.
for
and
miscellaneous revenue? And then would we delete, then decrease the tax revenue levy?
No, so the difference between 2 and 3 nets out to 0.
Okay,
It's just moving the tax levy in the appropriate spot, but because everything funnels through the treasurers, that's why it has to hit in there.
so again, would deleting paragraph 1, modifying sales tax to miscellaneous revenue,
In 2,
and 2 serve the purpose?
correct.
So is that your motion, Supervisor Marshall?
Yes, it's a net sum of zero tax levy, as Director Bensky had said.
Does that do what?
Correct. Yes.
All right, so the motion before us, and I'm taking liberty, I wish, in trying to interpret what the format of the motion is. So both Supervisor Marshall moved to delete paragraph 1, change sales tax in paragraph 2 to miscellaneous revenue. And that's it. And that would net us that thing. Supervisor Poole, is that your intent to second, as a second?
Yes, I'll second it.
All right, that was the original. Okay. Any discussion on the motion? Not all those in favor of that motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no? No. The motion is defeated on a 3-2 vote. Then the issue is the amendment offered. What are your wishes relative to the amendment as offered, the original amendment? Without the amendment, we defeated the amendment to the amendment, now we're on the amendment to the publication. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of that amendment will signify.
I'll have some comments, please, Mr. Chair. I'm all for economic development and getting these foreclosed properties back on the market as soon as possible, but I just don't have enough information or see enough details. I'd like to see perhaps it go through the regular committee process where I could see, hear more from stakeholders and hear more of the merits and ramifications before supporting it. I'm not inclined just to add additional taxpayer dollars to something that's ill-defined.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, if not, all those in favor of the amendment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no.
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 That motion carries. Let me just point out that we will, on the 22nd, ask for more clarification prior to going to the board, but that will now be part of the published budget. And people are welcome to comment on that at both the 22nd meeting and in the public hearing. Now the issue is authorization of the budget for publication with the amendment as amended. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Thank you. We had in the packet put in the resolution for the sale of the property on 8th Avenue. Unfortunately, that did not get agendized, so we will take that up at our 22nd meeting. Is there anything else to come before us today? If not, a motion to adjourn is in order. Moved by Supervisor Hart, seconded by Chair Gibbs. All those in favor of adjournment will signify by saying aye. Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That carries.